So today I'm reading chapter 7. I've put a little note on the lesson today saying that I am skipping the bits about the curse. So if you're reading along with me, I'm going to skip the curse bits, but we're going to come back to them at a later date in the learning journey. So it's the same as what you've been used to all week. I'm going to be reading it, giving you some questions, then you can pause the video and have a go at the questions. I'm beginning to wish I brought sunglasses outside, but let's see how we get on. So, chapter 7. The shovel felt heavy in Stanley's soft, fleshy hands. He tried to jam it into the earth, but the blade banged against the ground and bounced off without making a dent. The vibrations ran up the shovel and into Stanley's wrists, making his bones rattle. It was still dark. The only light came from the moon and the stars, more stars than Stanley had ever seen before. It seemed he'd only just gotten to sleep when Mr. Pendanski came in and woke everyone up. Using all his might, he brought the shovel back onto the dry lake bed. The force stung his hands but made no impression on the earth. He wondered if he had a defective shovel. What does defective mean? Use the clues in the text. He glanced at Zero, about 15 feet away, who scooped out a shovelful of dirt and dumped it into the pile that was already almost a foot tall. For breakfast, they'd been served some kind of lukewarm cereal. The best part was the orange juice. They each got a pint carton. The cereal didn't actually taste too bad, but it smelt just like his cot. Then they filled their canteens, got their shovels, and were marched out across the lake. Each group was assigned a different area. Now it says the lake here, but we know there's no lake. It's just a big area of dry ground where the lake used to be. The shovels were kept in a shed near the showers. They all looked the same to Stanley, although X-Ray had his own special shovel, which no one else was allowed to use. X-Ray claimed it was shorter than others, but if it was only by a fraction of an inch. Why would having a shorter shovel be better than the other shovels? Think about the holes. The shovels were 5 feet long, from the tip of the steel blade to the end of the wooden shaft. Stanley's hole would have to be as deep as his shovel, and he'd have to be able to lay the shovel flat across the bottom in any direction. That's why X-Ray wanted the shorter shovel. The lake was so full of holes and mounds that it reminded Stanley of pictures he'd seen of the moon. If you find anything interesting or unusual, Mr. Pendanski had told him, you should report it to me or Mr. Sir when we come round with the water truck, and if the warden likes it, you'll get the rest of the day off. What are we supposed to be looking for? Stanley asked him. You're not looking for anything, you're digging to build character. But if you find anything, the warden would like to know. He glanced helplessly at his shovel. It wasn't defective. He was defective. He noticed a thin crack in the ground and he placed the point of his shovel on top of it and then jumped on the back of the blade with both feet. The shovel sank a few inches into the packed earth. He smiled. For once in his life, it paid to be overweight. So he's jumped onto his shovel and it's gone into the ground. And he's saying, yeah, for once in my life, it's quite good to be overweight, to be quite heavy. Why do you think that is? He leaned on the shaft and pulled up his first shovelful of dirt and then he dumped it onto the side. Only 10 million more to go, he thought, and then he placed the shovel back into the crack and jumped on it again. He unearthed several shovels full of dirt in this manner before it occurred to him that he was dumping dirt within the perimeter of his hole. He laid his shovel flat on the ground and marked where the edges of his hole would be. 5 feet was awfully wide. He moved the dirt he'd already dug up past his mark. He took a drink from the canteen. 5 feet would be awfully deep too. The digging got easier after a while. The ground was hardest at the surface, where the sun had baked a crust, and below that the earth was looser. But by the time Stanley broke through the crust, a blister had formed in the middle of his right thumb, and it hurt to hold the shovel. But Stanley was still digging. His hole was about 3 feet deep, but only in the centre. It sloped upwards to the edges. The sun had only just come up over the horizon, but he could already feel its hot rays on his face. When he reached down to pick up his canteen, he felt a sudden rush of dizziness, and he put his hands to his knees to steady himself. Can you give 2 reasons from the text as to why he would suddenly feel a rush of dizziness? So 2 reasons from the text. For a moment he thought he might throw up, but the moment passed and he drank the last drop of water from his canteen. He had blisters on every one of his fingers and even in the centre of his palm. Everyone else's holes were a lot deeper than his. He couldn't actually see their holes, but he could tell by the size of their dirt piles. He saw a cloud of dust moving across the wasteland, and he noticed that the other boys had stopped digging and were watching it too. The dirt cloud moved closer and closer, and he could see that it trailed behind a red pickup truck. The truck stopped near where they were digging, and the boys lined up behind it. X-ray in front, 0 at the rear. Stanley got in line behind 0. What do you notice about the order in which they're lining up in? X-ray at the front, 0 at the rear, and Stanley in line behind 0. What do you notice about that particular order? Mr. Sir filled each of their canteens from a tank of water in the back of the pickup truck. He took Stanley's canteen from him and said, "This isn't the Girl Scouts, is it?" We know he likes saying that, don't we? Stanley raised and lowered one shoulder. Mr. Sir followed Stanley back to his hole to see how he was doing. "You better get on with it, or else you'll be digging during the hottest part of the day." He popped some sunflower seeds into his mouth, and then he spat the shells into Stanley's hole. Stanley's blisters had ripped open and new blisters had formed. He kept changing his grip on the shovel to try and avoid the pain. Finally, he took off his cap and he held it between the handle of the shovel and his hands. This helped, but digging was harder because the cap would slide and slip, and then the sun beat down on his unprotected head and his neck. Though he tried to convince himself otherwise, he'd been aware for a while that his piles of dirt were too close to his hull. His piles were outside his 5-foot circle, but he could see he was going to run out of room. Still, he pretended otherwise and kept adding more dirt to the piles that he would eventually have to move. The problem was that when the dirt was in the ground, it was compacted, and then it expanded when it was excavated. It expanded when it was excavated. Think about what excavated could mean. The piles were a lot bigger than his hole was deep. It was either now or later, and reluctantly he climbed out of his hole and once again dug his shovel into his previous dug dirt. The next time the water truck came by, it was driven by Mr. Pendanski, who also brought along lunches. Stanley sat with his back against a pile of dirt and ate. He had a bologna sandwich, potato chips, and a large chocolate cookie. "How you doing?" asked Magnet. "Not real good," said Stanley. "Well, the first hole's the hardest," Magnet said. Why is the first hole the hardest? Think about why that could be. Stanley took a long, deep breath. He couldn't afford to dawdle. He was way behind the others and the sun just kept getting hotter. It wasn't even noon yet, but he didn't know if he had the strength to stand up. He thought about quitting. He wondered what they might do to him. What could they do to him? His clothes were soaked with sweat. In school, he'd learnt that sweating was good for you. It was nature's way of keeping you cool. So why was he so hot? Using his shovel for support, he managed to get to his feet. Where are we supposed to go to the bathroom?" he asked Magnet. Magnet gestured with his arms to the great expanse around them. "Pick a hole, any hole," he said. Stanley staggered across the lake, almost falling over a dirt pile. Behind him he heard Magnet say, "But first, make sure nothing's living in it." Zero was the smallest kid in Camp D, but he was the first to finish digging. "You're finished?" Stanley asked enviously. What does enviously mean? Think about what Zero's done. Think about Stanley's reaction. What do you think enviously means? Zero said nothing. Stanley walked towards Zero's hole and watched him measure it with his shovel. The top of his hole was a perfect circle, and the sides were smooth and steep, and not one dirt clod more than necessary had been removed from the earth. Zero pulled him up to the surface. He didn't even smile. He looked down in his perfectly dug hole, spat in it, and then turned and headed back to the camp. "Zero's one weird dude," said Zigzag. Stanley would have laughed, but he didn't have the strength. Zero had to be the weirdest dude Stanley had ever seen. He had a long, skinny neck, a big round head with wild, frizzy hair that stuck out in all directions. His head seemed to bob up and down on his neck like it was on a spring. Armpit was the second one to finish, and he also spat in his hole before heading back to the compound. One by one, Stanley watched each boy spit into his hole and return back to camp. Stanley kept digging. His hole was almost up to his shoulders, although it was hard to tell exactly where ground level was because his dirt piles surrounded the hole. The deeper he got, the harder it was to raise the dirt up out of the hole. Once again, he realised he was going to have to move the piles. His cap was now stained with blood from his hands, and he felt like he was digging his own grave. Stanley's hole was then as deep as his shovel, but not quite wide enough on the bottom. He grimaced as he sliced off a chunk of dirt, raised it up, and flung it onto a pile. He laid his shovel back down on the bottom of his hole, and to his surprise, it fit. He rotated it, only to chip off a few chunks of dirt here and there before he could lie his shovel flat across the hole in every direction. He heard the water truck approaching, and he felt a strange sense of pride to be able to show Mr. Sir or Mr. Pendanski that he had dug his first hole. He put his hands on the rim and he tried to pull himself up, but he couldn't do it. Why couldn't he do it? Why couldn't he pull himself up out of the hole? He used his legs to help, but he was trapped in the hole. It was almost funny, but he was not in the mood to laugh. "Stanley!" he heard Mr. Pendanski call. Using his shovel, he dug 2 footholes into the hole wall and he climbed out to see Mr. Pendanski walking over. "I was afraid you'd fainted," Mr. Pendanski said. "You wouldn't have been the first." "I'm finished," Stanley said, putting his blood-spotted cap back on his head. "All right," said Mr. Pendanski, raising his hand for a high five. But Stanley ignored it. He didn't have the strength. Mr. Pendanski lowered his hand and looked at Stanley's hole. "Well done," he said. "You want to ride back?" Stanley shook his head. "I'll walk." Mr. Pendanski climbed into the truck without filling Stanley's canteen. Stanley waited for him to drive away, then took another look at his hole. He knew it was nothing to be proud of, but he felt proud nevertheless. He sucked up the last bit of saliva and spat. Okay, so that was chapter 7. If you were to name chapter 7 with a word or a phrase, what would you name it? So the name of the chapter needs to summarise what's happened. So what would you name chapter 7? So that is all of the Holes reading for this week. So on Monday we will pick up where we left off. Have a lovely day tomorrow. It's VE Day, so it's a day full of celebration. Hopefully the sun is shining. Just remember, this is Wednesday's lesson, isn't it? So have a lovely Thursday and then have a lovely VE Day. And well done with your Google Classrooms work this week. Okay, good job, Year 5.